What I'm drawing here is actually a myelinated neuron, and I'm going to go into some of its basic functions and the mechanism of the action potential. A neuron transduces a chemical signal to further target cells through its synaptic knobs, and that signal is passed through the axon of the neuron via the myelin and the nodes of Ranvier. We're going to go into the actual mechanism in a moment, but it is important to realize that these signals come from the soma where the nucleus is contained, and that this electrical signal is transferred from the soma to the axon terminus, which is an anterograde movement. Kinesin is a protein that moves vesicles along microtubules, eventually down into the synaptic cleft where they produce a chemical response in the target cell. Now, a resting membrane potential is around negative 65 millivolts to negative 70 millivolts, and it is through this resting potential that the cell produces a chemical response in target cells. Now we're going to go into the steps of the action potential. In the very first step, we can see that around negative 70 millivolts, a resting membrane potential for a regular neuron, the resting membrane potential is actually fluctuating up and down due to the constant flux of ions through the membrane. This change in ion concentration eventually leads the cell to hit negative 50 millivolts, and this is where the gated sodium ion channels are opened and they start flooding the cell, depolarizing its membrane. The action potential propagates forward. Once hitting this threshold value of negative 50 millivolts, the membrane potential continues to depolarize until hitting positive 35 millivolts. This is where the voltage sodium gates inactivate and the voltage gated potassium channels open, thus repolarizing the neuron. Now, it is important to note that these channels, the potassium channels, voltage gated, actually open more slowly and stay open longer. And I looked into why, and that's actually just because of kinetics. So I don't think the MCAT will actually ask you about that, but it's just a good fact to know. Now, you will reach inactivation of this channel around negative 80 to negative 90 millivolts, concluding the repolarization step of the action potential. Finally, the sodium-potassium pump is what returns the cell to its regular resting potential, and from there, the action potential mechanism begins again. Now, what I've drawn here is a cross-section of a neuron, and it's a very rough drawing. It's also important to note that the square right there is not a myelin sheath, it's just the area that the next action potential is going to begin on. I drew this to actually exemplify what I like to call the proximal induction mechanism. No, that is not an actual name for it, but this is what my friends and I actually called it when we were studying it. The reason is, if you actually look at this graph, you see that the positive charge on the outside of the cell and the negative charge on the inside of the cell are going with the arrow, which is the action potential. The box actually indicates a slightly negative region of the membrane, and thus it's closer to the threshold. I try to actually visualize this box moving along with the action potential and the arrow representing where the action potential has already been. I don't know if this will help you visualize it, but it does help me, so I drew it for you guys. This concludes my video on the neuron.